The investigation of these cases lead us to believe that there would have been additional victims.
What started as an ordinary Friday quickly turned into a nightmare that would leave 3 people dead and a community gripped by fear. Police arrested David Lever, a local real estate agent who they say is behind the brutal killings. But with the chilling discovery of a massive stash of weapons inside his home, authorities are left wondering if this could have been far worse. We're going to break it all down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We have this series of brutal murders that has rocked the otherwise quiet town of Greenville, North Carolina last week. We're talking about how 3 people were found dead, and now the town is trying to make sense of what happened. 3 people. And police say the man behind all of this violence is David Lever, a 55-year-old real estate agent who is now facing murder charges connected to what is the senseless killing, again, of 3 people. 64-year-old Enrique Reyes, 76-year-old Paula Gribble, and 80-year-old Tony Gribble. Authorities say he gunned them down in seemingly random acts that all unfolded on January 10th. By the way, we searched for David Lever on TruthFinder, the powerful background checker, and all we had to do was put in his name, location, and his information popped right up. Under his criminal history, several citations are listed, including a domestic violence case in February 2024, but we weren't able to independently confirm that one. But I'll tell you what, Law&Crime, we partner with TruthFinder. We use it all the time to get details on the people involved in our stories. But even if you don't work in true crime, this can just be an excellent resource to give you some peace of mind. After all, it's one of the largest public record search services in the United States. And with a paid subscription service, you can get access to unlimited reports about almost anyone. So right now, if you're interested, you can get 50% off of your first month of confidential background reports. Just go to truthfinder.com/LC Sidebar. And we also looked up Lever on the North Carolina Real Estate Commission website, which shows his license being first issued back in 2004. It's still listed as active. And we're going to start at the beginning here because there is a lot to unpack. But first, I want to bring on special guest Jeremy Eldridge, criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, first time on Sidebar. Thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So I got to first ask just your general thoughts on this case when you first read about it. I mean, it's not every day you see something like this, a mass killing spree, and we'll get into potential motives in a minute, but just a bizarre case.
Of course, anytime that you see a large cache of weapons, in this case, over 50 firearms that are recovered from Mr. Lever's house and from his van, coupled with the fact that we have what are 2 potentially unrelated murders, that is going to make national news, and that's going to cause a stir because everyone wants to know, to your point, why? Why is an elderly couple who did one real estate transaction with him in 2014, why is that murder even related to a neighbor's murder down the street? Yeah. And everyone's asking why.
Well, let's try to get into that a little bit. So I want to break down the case as the timeline has unfolded, which I think is the right way to do it. So we have this press conference that happened yesterday where Pitt County Sheriff Paula Dance provided these just absolutely chilling details, which began a little after 1 in the afternoon.
At 1:20, evidence shows that the victim, Enrique Reyes, made a purchase from the food line on Stantonsburg Road, and this was at 1:20 p.m. It is believed that he returned to his residence located at 1458 Forest Acres Drive shortly after that time. David Lever, at this time, is seen coming and going from his residence located at 1521 Forest Acres Drive. At 1:28, David Lever leaves his residence driving his light-colored Sprinter van. At 1:41, David Lever arrives at the Speedway. At 1:44 p.m., David Lever leaves the Speedway in his Sprinter van, firing shots from the van as he left. He was traveling north on Highway 43 in the direction of Peace Ridge Court.
Now, according to the sheriff, Reyes was just stepping out of his home to grab groceries at a local Food Lion store when he unknowingly became the first victim in this deadly spree. Now, while what exactly happened in the exact moments leading up to his death, it kind of remains unclear, we do know that hours later, police discovered his body in the driveway of his home. What they did confirm, though, was that Reyes and Lever, they lived on the same street. So, Jeremy, I want your take on this. Do you think that police could look into Reyes' routine, maybe for clues as to why he was targeted here?
100%. I mean, what the police are releasing now is that Mr. Reyes went to the grocery store. It looks as though this crime may have occurred upon his arrival back to his house after visiting the grocery store, and potentially in close proximity to when the Grimbles, the elderly couple, was later murdered. One of the issues that we're not going to know, because frankly, the state's attorney's office and the police department aren't going to release these details, are what the exact timeline is. We know they've pulled footage from the grocery store. We don't know what other neighbors, for instance, may have had Ring doorbell cameras. That is what we're waiting to see now to maybe understand better whether Reyes got in the way, whether Reyes and Mr. Lever had an encounter, and if we can get some more details as to what would have motivated Lever to potentially have killed Mr. Reyes.
There's also a possibility he was watching him and knew where he would be, right?
100%. But anytime that somebody's driving around in a van with that many weapons, it stands to logic, and I'm sure that prosecutors in a later prosecution will use this, that he was obviously planning something. And now that we have these either related or unrelated murders, I think it's obvious that the cache of weapons that was in his van was part of his plan. The question is, did Grimble's son, who thwarted any potential other violence, what else was he planning to do when they searched his house? Are we going to find out that there was a manifesto of sorts?
Yeah, we're going to get to that too, but just going back to this, there is an element of mystery to this whole thing, because what happened was there was a passerby who didn't find Reyes' body until reportedly around 3:35 p.m. So this would have been after Lever was arrested. This is according to law enforcement, which we're going to get into more in a second. But Jeremy, from a defense perspective, does the uncertainty maybe surrounding the chain of events, the body being out there when it was discovered, could that be something that could be exploited by the defense in any which way? I mean, I think the evidence is probably pretty strong against him right now, but that timeline, that chain of events, does that help the defense in any which way?
100%. Whenever you're dealing with an investigation and subsequent prosecution of a case in which a body is found later, the first thing you're going to look at is the medical examiner is going to look at lividity. So do we have a timeline, given just the body itself, the pooling of the blood, can we tell how long that body's been stagnant or sitting there, right? After that, what you're going to look at are other surrounding or intervening circumstances, other cameras, other witness testimony to try to narrow down that timeline. Where that prosecution may be more difficult is that no one saw the crime occur. So you're going to be relying heavily on ballistics evidence. Did you get the gun recovered from Mr. Lever in this situation? Was the same gun that was used to kill the Grimbles used to kill Reyes? Do they have that weapon? And then what ballistics evidence do they have to support the fact that he murdered Reyes if no one saw?
Yeah, that was my question, because we know that Reyes was found dead in his driveway. We don't know if there were any witnesses who saw him shot there. So I was curious about how the prosecution is going to go up about proving that it was Lever. And by the way, if they can prove that he is guilty of one murder, does that necessarily mean that he could be guilty of all the murders?
I think that's a big question, right? First off, are these cases, would they be tried together? If all of the evidence in both of these cases is mutually admissible, then there's a very high probability that the cases end up being prosecuted together, which frankly will make the prosecution of the Reyes case far easier. Because if you have a very strong case against Lever regarding the Grimble murders, then frankly, the Reyes case is not going to be difficult to prove if the jurors are hearing all of the same evidence, because there's a lot of common sense standing in the way of Lever winning that at trial.
Yeah, it's interesting, because if Reyes returned home sometime after 1:20 when he left to get the groceries, and he was presumably killed around the time he returned, he was likely dead for a while before he was discovered. Does that raise any challenges to the investigation? Is that strange?
No, it's incredibly common. I mean, in most murder cases, frankly, where bodies are discovered, the bodies have been sitting there for a matter of not just hours, but oftentimes days or weeks. Yeah. And then the forensic team will come in, but we don't know if Lever wasn't wearing gloves, for instance. Did he leave any latents at scene? Is there any other DNA that they recovered from the scene? So it's not just a matter of ballistics evidence. There could be other forensic evidence that ties him to the scene. And at that point, the timeline becomes completely irrelevant, because once you have forensics involved, it'll become difficult to defend.
Let's go back into the timeline, because as authorities had worked to investigate the source of these gunshots at the nearby Speedway convenience store, the suspect, again believed to be Lever, was already on the move, and police say he was heading towards more victims. He allegedly made his way toward Peace Ridge Court. So this is a street that was home to the other victims in this case, Tony and Paula Gribble. And the sheriff says that before arriving at the Gribbles, he'd apparently stopped at another home, but by the time the homeowner got to the door, Lever was allegedly backing out of the driveway. The homeowner told police he didn't recognize the driver. Then, at 2:17 p.m., a call came in from their son, the Gribble son, to report what is essentially the unthinkable. His parents were dead.
Pitt County Sheriff's Office received a call in reference to a caller's parents having been murdered by David Lever at the residence at 2137 Peace Ridge Court. Deputies arrived to find Anthony and Paula Gribble dead from multiple gunshot wounds.
Now, the couple's son was already reeling from the horror of losing his parents, but what did he do? He bravely steps in and takes matters into his own hands.
At this time, David Lever was being held at gunpoint by the son of Anthony and Paula. David Lever was promptly taken into custody at this time by our officers. The investigation of these cases lead us to believe that there would have been additional victims had a family member of the victims not intervened until our deputies were able to arrive. No community is immune to tragic acts of violence such as these. However, through the previously mentioned actions of civilians and deputies, we were spared further tragedies as a part of this expanding series of crimes.
So according to the information from police, the Gribble's son arrives just moments after his parents were shot, and good thing he did it because he was able to apparently apprehend the suspect prior to police coming on the scene. Now, Jeremy, that's unbelievable. You know, the Gribble's son playing such a critical role in ending what could have been an even greater alleged campaign or rampage by holding Lever at gunpoint. What do you make of that? How does the timing of that phone call play a role in this investigation? What do you think about it?
Well, anytime you have a phone call to sort of know, that ends your timeline, right? We now know when certain events happen. So that's the benefit there. But the benefit to him being there, obviously, and I've heard this question asked, and I think it needs to get put to bed, is does the son have any legal problems? Could the son be charged, for instance? And I cannot see a single scenario where a district or state's attorney is going to file charges against the Gribble's son for not only stopping the violence, but whether it's self-defense, defense of others. North Carolina, as you know, is an open carry state. So as long as he doesn't have a record, he's in lawful possession of the firearm. But even if it wasn't an open carry state, being on his parents' property, being on private property, it's impossible to imagine that he has any legal quandary whatsoever to be looking at. And we now know that he stopped Lever from potentially committing other murders.
And what an important witness he's going to be at an upcoming trial, right?
It not only does he evoke sympathy for being the son of two murdered parents, but he's going to be their best witness because he puts the gun in Lever's hand. I mean, frankly, Lever is fortunate that he's alive to stay in trial, I think, which is what a lot of people are saying, which frankly goes to the character of Gribble who stopped this. Because I think in a lot of these situations, Lever may not be standing trial, especially in states like North Carolina and Texas that are open carry.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. I should tell you, look, authorities, they noted that about a half hour after Lever's arrest, so at about 2:50 p.m., this call comes in about a breaking in and entering at a nearby home on Forest Acres Drive. And while no one was home, the house had been shot into, apparently. Investigators suspect that it was Lever. This is according to the sheriff at the news conference. Then, as we mentioned, just after 3:30, Reyes was found dead in the driveway on the same street where Lever had lived. So later that evening, still on January 10th, authorities had obtained warrants, and these included for David Lever's home, his vehicle, and what they uncovered was chilling.
A large number of firearms were found at that residence, along with ammunition. Lever's Sprinter van was at Peace Ridge Court crime scene and was found to contain a large number of loaded handguns and rifles, along with additional ammunition and loaded magazines. I believe that there was rifles, handguns. There were some firearms also attempted to be removed from the deceased couple's home. But I would say at least 50 firearms, if I'm not mistaken, inside of the residence of the suspect. There were a lot of firearms inside of the residence of the deceased.
So what are we talking about? More than 50 firearms, including rifles, handguns, a large cache of ammunition. And this raises some very serious questions. Was Lever, Jeremy, allegedly planning for something more extensive? What do you think?
I think it's obvious that he was. And this is the predicament that we get into when we're discussing the regulation of the purchase of large amounts of firearms or adding rapid triggers to certain types of firearms. But what we have here is a man who is inarguably in lawful possession of these firearms. He had no criminal convictions. There's nothing under North Carolina law that prevented him from owning these firearms. But it's not just the owning of the firearms in the home that I think raises the question that you're going towards. It's the fact that the cash is in the van. It's the asportation. It's the traveling with this number of firearms that's indicative of an intent to commit massive violence.
Or maybe, and I'm purely speculating here, maybe it was a way to defend himself against authorities if he thought he was going to be caught. Because the motive here is still the question. We talked about at the beginning, because Sheriff Dance confirmed there is no known connection between Lever and the victims, leaving investigators puzzled about what would be the motives for gunning down all these people in just rapid succession. Now, I will tell you, WITN reported that the Gribbles did use Lever as their realtor when they purchased their home back in 2014. This is what Jeremy was talking about before. So it hints to a potential link between him and the couple, but what exactly drove him to allegedly commit these horrific acts, that remains unclear. Now, David Lever's background has raised even more questions about the man allegedly behind these brutal killings. We did some digging. We found him listed on Zillow, where he boasts a 5-star rating out of 16 reviews, all praising his work. He also apparently has a real estate company, Realty World, Lever and Russell, which touts on its website, hire a top-class real estate agent who will invest in your future. Jeremy, this is the part that is so strange, because in cases where there's no obvious connection between the defendant and the victims, what does the prosecution do here? Because I know they don't have to prove motive, but they need to tell a story here that makes sense to the jury. How does that complicate it?
I think the obvious undercurrent that is going to play a significant role in the prosecution of this case, to your point, is going to be whether we learn that he was struggling with a mental health issue. What's fairly obvious, for instance, if you look at the photograph of Mr. Lever on the website versus the photograph at the time of his arrest, you look like somebody, and I don't mean to use names like Ted Kaczynski, but you look at somebody who looks unkept. You're looking at somebody who is not engaging in self-grooming. These are often the hallmarks of somebody that is struggling with mental health. So I think one thing is I would be wildly unsurprised if we didn't find out that there's a mental health defense. That plays into the bigger question, which is when you're looking at a series of unrelated killings, it's oftentimes driven by some level of paranoia or something linking to a more significant mental health issue. Or it could be as simple as there were neighborhood issues that haven't been exposed yet, that there were, that I'll tell you, some of the most serious cases that I've had to deal with, even misdemeanor cases, and ugly ones are when neighbors get into it. Guns being pulled on each other, guns being pointed for no reason, people being upset about putting a fence on one side of their house or a little bit on someone else's property. I think we're going to learn more that it's either A, that there's a mental health crisis, or B, that there were some unresolved neighborhood issues that we may potentially learn about that Reyes might have gotten mixed up in. And then we find out that something that may be very small to someone like you or me ended up being something very big to somebody that was struggling mentally.
There's one thing to say, you never know what people are thinking. And I guess it's the truth with half the cases that we cover here on Sidebar. But you mentioned mental health, and I'm so glad you did, because I want to ask you about one more thing. I wanted to ask you about his court appearance. So Lever makes his first court appearance yesterday, where he was ordered to be held without bond. And according to WITN reporters who were present in the courtroom, Lever reportedly yelled at the judge, calling him a word that we can't say here. But the outburst, right, only adds to the drama of this case. Jeremy, does that kind of outburst, affect the idea of mental health defense, or at least maybe a competency issue?
I think both of those issues are going to be significant issues in this case. Competency, whether he can assist in his own defense and whether he understands the nature of the charges. That could lead to a serious delay in prosecuting this case if we find out that he had a serious mental health break, and to medicate him, what we call medicating into compliance. So can they figure out what his diagnosis is, medicate him, and then for him to stand trial? Those things can delay cases by 6 months to a year or even more than that. Some individuals never regain competency. Here, I don't know whether a simple outburst in the courtroom is indicative of it, but I think it's indicative of the larger issue, which is there is clearly a mental health issue. Whether it rises to the level of a true what's called not criminally responsible, or some people call it not guilty by reason of insanity, or whether it's more of a what's called diminished capacity issue. And that's where North Carolina is a little different than, for instance, other states like Maryland and New York.
All right, Jeremy Eldridge, thank you so much for coming on, breaking it down with me. Really, really appreciate it. And, you did. I loved having you on. I can't wait to have you back for another case that we cover. Unfortunately, whatever that case might be. I know it's probably not going to be a great one, but appreciate your perspective. Loved having you on.
I love coming on. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to returning.
Now, before we finish up, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about. There's another possible connection between the victims, and that might be East Carolina University. See, the Gribble's son, David T.D. Gribble, is a professor in the school's College of Business, according to its website. And ECU officials confirmed to WCTI that Dr. Enrique Reyes was a professor in biology before retiring in 2022. Paula Gribble had also worked as an educator, teaching nursing at Coastal Carolina. Reyes was remembered fondly in his obituary, with his family members writing, "Enrique was a man known for his warmth, kindness, and unwavering support for his loved ones. His untimely death has left a profound impact on everyone who knew him. As he was more than just a neighbor or friend, he was a pillar of strength and positivity." For the Gribbles, the pain is just as deep. Their son told WCTI that Tony was a decorated Vietnam War veteran, had served 2.5 tours as a recon Marine, earning 5 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star. He was a hero. Paula was a nurse educator who spent nearly 4 decades helping others. Both were faithful people, as their son described them, saying, "A lot of people teach their faith, but very few live it. My parents lived it day in, day out." As for David Lever, he remains at the Pitt County Detention Center without bond, facing 3 counts of felony murder. He's scheduled to return to court on January 29th, and authorities have stated that additional charges may follow as the investigation progresses. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us, and as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.